Hello, everybody. Welcome. As everybody comes in from the waiting room, we will get started in just a minute or two. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. See everybody coming in. We will get started with our webinar in just a minute or so. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Charlie Francis. I am a project manager here at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. And I want to welcome you to our webinar today. This will be the first webinar in our series, Thinking Outside the Box, Cross-Sector Strategies to Create Housing Opportunities. You know, if for people who sit within the criminal justice system, we all know that one of the top needs that we have is connecting people with safe and affordable housing. Not only is it the right thing to do, but it's one of the most effective ways to prevent people from becoming involved with the justice system again in the future. But if you sit within the criminal justice system, you don't necessarily control how housing is funded or where housing gets built. The real secret in getting this work done is building strong and sustained cross-sector partnerships. That's really going to be the focus of this series. And today we're going to introduce you to a four-part framework to help build those partnerships. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, we have this in the chat. We have a couple of links for tech support if you are having any issues with the Zoom webinar interface. And also, we will hopefully have some time for questions and answers at the end. But in the meantime, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions if possible. We will try to answer those live if we can at the end. And also we have some staff that may be able to answer them in the Q&A box during the webinar. But as far as who are we? We are the Council of State Governments Justice Center. We're a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization combining the power of a membership association serving state officials in each branch of government with policy and research expertise. We develop strategies that increase public safety and strengthen communities. Next slide, please. And we would not be able to do this work without the generous support of the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance. They are funding this entire series, and BJA, their mission is providing leadership and assistance to local criminal justice programs and improve and reinforce the nation's criminal justice system. We have a bit more language here on BJA's goals and BJA's programs. They do a wide range of work to really support people who are working in the system to help it make it more efficient, effective, and fair. Next slide, please. And then the BJA program that's supporting this work specifically is what's known as the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program, or JMHCP. JMHCP promotes innovative cross-system collaboration and it provides grants directly to states, local governments, and federally recognized Indian tribes. The goal of JMHCP is to improve responses to people with mental illnesses and substance use disorders who are involved in the criminal justice system. Now, JMHCP is supporting us in doing this work, but it also supports a number of state and local partners around the country working in their communities. And we're going to highlight a couple of examples of JMHCP supported work during this webinar. Next slide. And then our partner during this series is the Corporation for Supportive Housing. CSH is the national champion for supportive housing, demonstrating its potential to improve the lives of highly impacted community members, including people who've been involved with the justice system, by helping people create housing. They have expertise in funding, advocacy, and technical assistance. They provided nearly $1 billion in direct loans and grants for supportive housing around the country. And like us, they really believe in working across systems and equipping communities to develop solutions that meet their unique needs. So we're so pleased to have CSH as a partner in this important work. Next slide. So our outline for today, after some brief introductions and an overview of what this webinar series is going to cover, I'm going to talk just a little bit to do some level setting around what the research says, and specifically the role of housing in improving criminal justice outcomes. Then I'm going to introduce the Action Points framework, which is the guiding framework for this entire series. It's a 4-part framework. We originally developed for state leaders, but it really applies to you no matter where you sit, what your community is. It's a 4-part framework to really be able to work across systems and move the needle to increase access to and availability of housing for people who've been involved with the justice system. Then we're going to dive a little deeper into the first step of the Action Points framework, which is partnership building. I'm going to talk about who some of the key housing partners are that are out there, the resources they control, and strategies for building effective partnerships. And then I'm so pleased to have Zach Schaffner with us from the state of Colorado. They've done some really amazing work over the years to develop these cross-system partnerships and increase the supply of housing for vulnerable folks across the state, but also specifically with the focus on people who've been involved with the justice system. So Zach is going to take us through the work that they've done in Colorado, some of the programs that they have, the outcomes that they're seeing, their philosophy, and hopefully that'll be a really nice example of what can be accomplished over time when you follow a comprehensive framework like this. And finally, we'll just share some brief resources and next steps and tee up the rest of our webinar series, as well as our office hours, which I'll introduce later. We're going to have an exciting opportunity for anybody who participates in this webinar series to ask more questions to subject matter experts and presenters, and really get some focused small group TA to help you take these lessons back to your community. Next slide. So we got a lot of folks here, so we can't do verbal introductions, but if you would, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and say hello. Just put your name, the agency that you're with, city and state, and what sector, where you sit, criminal justice, behavioral health, housing, or other systems. We'd love to know who is here in the Zoom room with us from across the country. And then again, as questions arise during the webinar, go ahead and use the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can. Next slide. So what are we going to cover in this webinar series? So today is going to be an overview of our Action Points framework, but then the remaining 4 sessions are going to dive deeper into steps 2, 3, and 4 of that framework. So session 2 is going to really focus on existing housing. This is a time of increased resources for housing, particularly at the federal level, that we haven't seen in quite a while. And it's important to know what are the most promising strategies from being able to prioritize those resources for people who are leaving the justice system, as well as to really be able to assess someone's needs, who's in prison or jail, to be able to make sure that they're matched with housing that meets their needs when they come out, and really help with the reentry process. And then in session 3, we're going to move towards a focus on development. It's very important to efficiently connect people with housing, but ultimately, I think everybody on this webinar knows that in nearly every corner of the United States, there's just not enough affordable housing to meet the needs of any population, especially people who have been involved with the justice system. In session 4, we're going to follow that theme a little bit further. Investing in housing, particularly at the scale that we need, takes money, whether we're at the community level or the state level or any other level. And so we're going to talk about some specific strategies for how to make the business case for housing. Not only is creating housing opportunities for people leaving the justice system the right thing to do, but there are some pretty powerful cost-saving arguments, particularly with regard to other public systems, such as the emergency medical system and the emergency shelter system. And then our final session, we're going to bring it all together. Every one of these sessions is going to feature at least one community example of a place that's doing this work, but session 5 will feature several and really give you a range of different strategies and best practices for communities who are doing this work. We're also going to focus on the role of the healthcare sector and helping connect people with housing. There's a real exciting move in the field right now, really centering housing as a social determinant of health. And then we'll also talk about some other creative funding sources and models to more effectively serve people with justice involvement. Next slide. So we're going to do some level setting first and talk about the role of housing in criminal justice outcomes. So on the next slide, we have a chart showing the percentage change of all people experiencing homelessness and people exiting correctional institutions experiencing homelessness. Now, this is from a few years ago, because unfortunately, the Department of Housing and Urban Development is no longer reporting this data in the same way. But for most of the past decade, overall homelessness was declining, but releases into homelessness from correctional institutions were rising. Now, since then, and particularly since the onset of the pandemic, a couple of things have changed. Unfortunately, homelessness has been rising for a number of years, largely due to just housing costs rising so much in so many parts of the country, especially relative to incomes. And then also, many states and localities over the past couple of years with the onset of the pandemic have really tried to take a lot of steps to reduce their jail populations and also to release folks into environments other than congregate shelters to reduce the risk of COVID-19 transmission. And there's been some success in doing that, but now we're at a moment in time where I like to think the question is, now what? There's a real need for folks, who maybe have been released into these non-congregate or even into shelter settings to be connected with permanent housing. So some of the dynamics have changed, but the bottom line is folks being released from prison or jail and not having stable permanent housing identified is still a big and widespread problem. Next slide. Another theme that we're going to come back to a lot today and throughout the series is the theme of a shared population. Housing providers, particularly affordable housing providers, have a tough job. They are constantly being asked to do more with less. And sometimes there's a feeling that there are so many vulnerable populations in need of housing. How do we possibly prioritize them all? And so sometimes folks from the criminal justice system can get some pushback because it's difficult. But the reality is the criminal justice system, the affordable housing system, and the health and behavioral health systems are all serving a lot of the same people. We did some work a couple of years ago doing an analysis of barriers to reentry housing in California. And we pulled some data from across California, as well as some comparison points from other states. And we were able to see that, as you'll see here, up to about 25% of folks in jail are likely going to be in need of some kind of ongoing housing subsidy and some level of mental health services. Honestly, I think these are probably underestimates, particularly for the jail population, but the fact remains that there is a lot of data from many communities across the country showing the overlap in these populations. And that's an important argument to make in terms of being able to prioritize people who are leaving the justice system. Next slide. Now, unfortunately, we can tend to be looking at a vicious cycle when it comes to housing instability and involvement with the justice system. And that's represented in the diagram that we have here. If you've been on any of our other housing webinars in the past, you may have seen this diagram before. It's one we use a lot because unfortunately, this is happening in many communities across the country. People who are experiencing homelessness, particularly people who are experiencing what we call unsheltered homelessness, so living on the streets, in their cars, or other places not meant for human habitation, they're more likely to have encounters with law enforcement, particularly because you have to do many of activities of daily living, such as sleeping or using the bathroom outside. And often, there are laws and ordinances in different communities criminalizing this behavior. And law enforcement can get frustrated because they may not have a lot of other options besides arrest or citation or move on orders. But then once somebody becomes involved with the justice system, particularly if they didn't have stable housing before getting involved with the justice system, they are less likely to be diverted from jail and prison. And once someone has been incarcerated, or even once they, have any sort of criminal record, that can be a real barrier to getting housing. There's a lot of stigma out there, and there are also many housing providers that have policies really limiting access to housing for people with criminal records. This can include long look-back periods, for offenses that have occurred, a long time in the past, disqualifying someone from access to housing now. We'll touch on this later. HUD has actually made a powerful statement last month by releasing a directive directly from Secretary Fudge, directing all HUD departments to examine their programs and reduce barriers to participation for people with criminal records. We are very happy about that move because that will really go a long way towards breaking this cycle. But as of now, it's still a major problem. And finally, the last part of the cycle, lack of stable housing upon exit from jail or prison, can also increase your likelihood of community supervision violations. So what we're going to be talking about today is breaking this cycle, particularly in step number one, at the front end of the justice system, because the best way to prevent somebody from becoming involved with the justice system is to keep them out of the system in the first place. Then also step three, once somebody has been involved with the justice system, being able to reduce barriers to housing and increase access to housing really can make a big difference in breaking this cycle. Next slide. So we talk a lot about the importance of providing safe, affordable, permanent housing. The question is, how do we do that? There is a lot of research out there showing that the most promising approach is what's called housing first. Now, many of you may have heard of the housing first approach before. It's a simple concept. The philosophy is to provide housing as quickly as possible and with as few barriers to entry, things like mandated sobriety or engagement in treatment. Now, that may sound counterintuitive, but there is a pretty good body of research out there showing that by connecting people with housing quickly, it actually helps them have a foundation for achieving larger goals, including recovery, engagement in treatment, employment, reconnections with family, and so much more. And the key thing about housing first is it's not housing only. Just because you're not mandating sobriety or engagement with treatment doesn't mean that these things don't matter. In fact, to do housing first well, you need to be assertively and frequently offering services in conjunction with housing and giving people the opportunity to engage with these services where they live and on their own terms. But as far as the research evidence goes, there are a number of studies out there showing that the housing first approach reduces contact with law enforcement, reduces returns to prison and jail, reduces costs to systems such as the emergency medical system and the emergency shelter system, and increases participation in services in the long run. Next slide. So given that foundation, now I want to introduce you to our action points framework. So on the next slide, you'll see a screenshot. This was originally introduced in a brief that we published last year which you can find on our website, and we'll link it, provide you the link at the end of this webinar. This is a framework we originally developed targeted towards state leaders, but as I said before, it's really applicable to you no matter where you sit, because they're, from our experience working with communities across the country and reviewing the research, there are some real common themes in terms of what works for increasing housing opportunities. The reason we have a 4-step framework is because increasing access to housing for people leaving the justice system can be complicated, and you need to do more than one thing. Specifically, you need to build partnerships across the housing, criminal justice, and behavioral health systems. You need to be able to effectively assess someone's housing needs, because unfortunately the supply of housing is limited, and we want to make sure that the people with the highest needs are getting connected, to housing first, and to housing with the most intense level of subsidy and services. We also have a big focus in the framework on connecting people with existing housing, whether it's through a public housing authority, through privately subsidized multifamily housing, to private landlords. It's very important to make sure that as people are leaving the justice system, they have pathways to connect with this housing. They don't fall through the cracks at reentry or diversion from the justice system either. And then finally, the last step in our framework is expand. Ultimately, there's just not enough housing. And so steps 1, 2, and 3 are where we need to start, and they're very important. But over time, we need to be continually, looking for different public and private resources to invest in growing the pie of housing, because ultimately that is what is really going to make a difference in the long run. Next slide. So I'm going to go into each step of the framework in a little bit more detail, tell you what's involved, and I'll give you a quick example of a community that has been doing good work in each step. So step 1 is collaborate. What does that mean? The first step is ensuring representation from different sectors in key planning bodies. And when I say key planning bodies, it can be a housing system planning body, such as a homeless assistance continuum of care. And I will go into what that is in just a little bit. It could also be a criminal justice planning body, such as a local criminal justice coordinating council. But what we've seen is that the best initiatives that connect people to housing leaving the justice system are the results of sometimes years of fruitful partnership building. And so that is just a fundamental step that really undergirds everything else. As you build these partnerships, it's important to formalize collaboration mechanisms as well. For example, we'll go into this a lot more in our next webinar, but being able to share data across systems, across the housing, criminal justice, and behavioral health systems is so important in being able to understand the scope of a population that we want to serve and their housing needs. Typically, you're going to need a number of agreements and MOUs to make that happen. So that is one example of formalized collaboration. And by the way, when I talk about cross-sector representation, I don't want to neglect the very important role of people with lived experience in the justice system or have experienced homelessness. They need to be meaningfully involved right from the beginning. I think a powerful example is the Housing First model itself. That was developed by listening to people with lived experience and understanding what made the difference for them in connecting with housing and staying housed. So that is just absolutely central to any planning effort. And then finally, also an important ingredient in this first step is regular cross-system training, which sounds simple, but the housing criminal justice systems are complicated. There's a lot of different terminology, and people really need to learn how to speak each other's language. So, having these opportunities for people to get to know each other and get to know each system will really pay dividends later on. Next slide. So a community example with regard to this first step is the Ohio Attorney General's Task Force on Mental Illness. Now, this is run through the Attorney General's office and includes a subcommittee focused solely on housing. It's made up of state behavioral health representatives, housing providers, and numerous other state and local agencies. And they discuss sort of the issues that they're seeing across systems and make recommendations to the Attorney General and the governor. And a particular outcome that came from this group was standing up a system for cross-system data sharing in Ohio. The state basically helped create the infrastructure and provided the resources to make that happen. And some communities have been piloting that work, including Cuyahoga County, and that has actually led to the creation of new supportive housing units. Next slide. Step 2 is assess. Very, very important. I think we all know inherently that people who are leaving the justice system have high housing needs. But in a lot of cases, particularly in the jail context, we don't have great data. And we need that data to be able to make the case to policymakers to be able to invest in more housing. We also need the data, as I was saying before, because at least for now, the supply of housing and services is limited. And we need to make sure that the people with highest needs are getting connected with the highest level of services. And people are just getting connected with different types of housing and services that match their needs coming out of the system. Somebody may need housing with a permanent subsidy and supportive services indefinitely, but someone else may just need a shorter term intervention, a small rental subsidy or help with moving costs to prevent becoming homeless at release. So it's so important to implement screening and assessment processes while people are still in the justice system and in prison and jail in particular. This can be especially difficult in a jail setting because their staffing resources are constrained, and especially because people are not there for very long. Sometimes they might be there for less than 24 hours. So any sort of screening tool has to be simple and quick. And there are a number of examples out there, both sort of standardized and published tools, as well as examples of what other communities are doing. So if you're looking to develop a tool, it's often best to just kind of see what's out there. And we actually have some examples on our website as well that we can share of just simple screening methods that you can use. But it's also important to be able to integrate these assessment tools into your actual workflows. Again, it's important in a prison and jail setting, but especially in a resource-constrained jail setting. Particularly in the jail setting, there is a role for state leaders to provide maybe funding to support staffing, to provide expertise in developing tools. There's some real state-local interplay that can be done there to really help make this more feasible in a jail setting. Also in a jail setting, sometimes we've seen some success with piloting these assessments on a limited basis in just a couple of jails, developing some proof of concept, and then really using that proof of concept to make the case to other facilities and sort of share what has worked in one place, to be able to gradually support expansion, to other jail-based settings. And finally, this data can be used for public reporting on risk of homelessness and housing needs. Again, because we've got to make the case to policymakers for investment and just be able to capture accurately the scope of the need among people leaving the justice system. So on the next slide, you'll see another community example, Sonoma County, California, who is actually a JMHCP grantee. They used the funding available under JMHCP to hire and support in-jail staff to do housing needs assessments prior to arraignment and connect them to housing with supportive services. And by doing these assessments, they learned that approximately 60% of people in their program have either experienced or at risk of experiencing homelessness. And they were able to build strong partnerships with community housing providers to leverage the results of this data and actually connect people with housing options. And one thing I particularly like about Sonoma is that they started this with JMHCP funding, but once their grant ended, they were able to sustain this program through a combination of American Rescue Plan, state, and local funds. Next slide. So step 3, connecting people with existing housing. If you'll recall the slide from a little while ago regarding the cycle of homelessness and justice involvement, this is where that really comes into play, especially that first part of the cycle. One really important strategy to connect people with housing is to keep them from coming into this justice system in the first place. And that's where there's a real role for both law enforcement and community responders to be able to conduct effective outreach. They are the ones who are out there day after day engaging with folks, but there's a real benefit there. There can be trust built and understanding over time and really relationships developed that can help in the long term be able to create a foundation to really be able to understand what people's housing needs are and to connect them with resources. So that is a real powerful strategy. In addition, embedding other entry points to the mainstream housing system, in particular to what's called the coordinated entry system. And I'll explain that a bit more as we go on, but suffice to say for now is that is a system that may be at the state, county, or municipal level of unified needs assessment, for people who are experiencing a risk of homelessness, to really be able to have a unified community-wide system of assessing their needs and connecting them and prioritizing them for available housing. Being able to do those assessments in a prison or jail or a diversion program setting is a really valuable strategy for connecting people with housing, before they potentially fall through the cracks in the reentry or diversion process. It can sometimes be less helpful for the people who've been within the justice system for an extended period of time, due to the sort of the intricacies of HUD policy, but it's an important tool in the toolbox. It's also important to facilitate conversations among housing agency leaders around assessment and prioritization of this population. Typically, particularly for HUD-funded programs, local housing agencies and stakeholders have a good deal of discretion in terms of who is prioritized for housing resources in their community. And it's important to be able to, and this is going back to step one, to be able to build partnerships across systems and be sitting at the same table to be able to really make community-wide decisions around who is prioritized for housing. It's also important to be monitoring how housing needs are assessed, who's being connected to housing in the community through coordinated entry and other systems, in particular with regard to looking at the data and seeing, for example, are people, of one or more racial or ethnic groups being disproportionately referred or not referred to housing. It's very important to really kind of look at community-wide data with an eye towards racial equity. This has been a particular emphasis of HUD lately, and we're very pleased to see that. And there's a lot of good resources out there on promoting racial equity through good data in the coordinated entry system. Next slide, please. And so our community example for this step of the framework is Sarasota, Florida. They were once known less than 10 years ago as the meanest city for homelessness in the country. But through collaborative efforts between law enforcement, the city, and housing partners, they created and staffed a homeless outreach team that now works with the continuum of care and local housing providers to conduct targeted and frequent outreach to folks and to connect and refer them to housing, right from the streets, right from shelters, wherever they might be encountered. And they actually work with the local Salvation Army to set aside dedicated beds to help people, get connected with housing, get off the streets right away. And then once they're in those beds, there is ongoing case management to help do further assessment and connect people with permanent housing resources. Next slide. And then finally, the last, but maybe the most important step of this framework is to expand the supply of affordable housing. How do we do that? This takes money, this takes time, but it is work that's absolutely worth doing. In addition to the point I made before about utilizing data to advocate for these investments, it's also important to look at what sort of no-cost and low-cost resources do you have available in your state or your community to help create more housing. These can be, for example, vouchers made available through a local housing authority to be able to subsidize rents. It can also be many states and localities have inventories of surplus public land that they make available for affordable housing development. It's also important to seek many different sources of funding and not just the usual suspects around federal and state funding. Non-traditional funding is very important. For example, there is a funding stream through the Department of Justice called BURN-JAG, Burn Justice Assistance Grants, flexible criminal justice funding that can actually be used for housing. And communities are increasingly doing just that. And I'll give you an example in just a second. Private funding is also important. Philanthropy has a role to play in this. We're going to get much more into this in the very last installment of our webinar series. But there's a model called flexible housing subsidy pools, where basically, typically, but not always seeded by philanthropy, where public and private sources pool funding to create a pool of resources to draw on to pay, particularly for rental assistance, but also for supportive services, as well as an infrastructure to be able to find units in the community, recruit landlords and housing providers to participate and help connect people with housing and keep them housed. And also, we can't talk about expanding housing access without talking about racial equity. And there are a number of different ways that this comes into play. For example, it's very important to really look at where proposed housing is going to be built. Is it in communities where there's been historical disinvestment? Is it in more highly resourced communities? As you're creating this housing, what's being done to ensure that people are having meaningful access to this housing? And then also, bringing, again, the voices of people with lived experience to the planning table at the early stage to determine where housing is being built, what type of housing is being built, what that housing looks like, and really engaging them from the ground up. Because equity is not just about race and ethnicity, but it's about really ensuring meaningful access for all people to housing resources. Next slide. So a final community example for expanding housing supply is the state of Connecticut. They have expanded access to housing through increased rental assistance. And the state basically has been pooling funding, which is an important and vital strategy, through this BURN-JAG grant that I was just talking about, as well as HUD funding and philanthropy, to be able to cover rental assistance, moving costs, and other interim housing costs, and other services to be able to help people with their housing search and stabilization. It uses a model which is called rapid rehousing, which basically means that providing targeted just-in-time supports to people to get them just the services that they need to prevent them from falling into homelessness, or to minimize the time spent homelessness, which can include assistance with rent, moving costs, housing search, etc. So they've employed this rapid rehousing approach, created a whole variety of funding, and they are effectively deploying this assistance to really triage people, assess people's housing needs as they're coming out of prison and jail, and have these supports to connect them with housing, especially in these critical days following reentry, before they get connected to longer-term housing options. Next slide. So now that I have introduced this framework to you and giving you some examples, we are going to have a through line through all of the installments in our webinar series about putting this framework to work. There are different pathways to increase housing opportunities for people who have been involved with the justice system. Two of the big ones are prioritizing people for existing housing, and then also focusing on housing development to increase the overall stock of available housing. In your state, in your community, you may want to focus on one or the other of these strategies, or both. So as you learn more through this series and hear from our community examples, I encourage you to keep that in mind. A third pathway that kind of brings both of these themes together is creating community-wide governance structures to create and facilitate access to a range of housing options. Again, we will go into this a lot more in our final webinar, but this can mean a whole range of things. In addition to prioritizing people for housing, it also involves bringing different housing funding agencies to the table to look at what's in the pipeline for new housing development. Which populations are being targeted? Where is this housing being built? Are people who've been involved with the justice system being prioritized? It can also involve a number of other things, including systematic efforts to work with housing providers to reduce barriers to housing access to people with criminal records. So really just want to encourage you to keep these pathways in mind and think about where you see your community in these process and what parts of the framework will be most useful to you. Next slide. So my last piece before I hand things over to Zach is I want to dive a little bit more into building partnerships with housing providers. It's just such a fundamental part of this framework and it undergirds everything else. I want to go through who some of the key housing providers might be in your state or community, the resources they control, and how some effective strategies for relationship building. Next slide. So an overview of the strategies, I've hit on some of these topics before, but it's really important to have a champion for prioritizing housing for people who are leaving the justice system. Because again, there are a lot of people in need for housing and it's easy to get lost in the shuffle. These champions can sit in a lot of different places. For example, they can be within the court system. The Cuyahoga County example I was talking about earlier, their initiative to develop supportive housing for people leaving the justice system was focused on people who had been cycling between jails, emergency rooms, and other public systems. But this was really spearheaded by the courts and really driven by a need that they saw with people who were coming before the court over and over again and just not being connected to stable housing. So that was really the impetus for them to reach out to their local continuum of care, to reach out to other housing providers, and to develop a system to really get people connected to housing, as soon as they came into contact with the court system. Other partnership building strategies, aligning funding, there are many, many different agencies at the state, federal, and local level that fund housing. It's a real worthwhile effort to sort of align funding timelines. But also, folks within the criminal justice system, in terms your funding priorities, maybe more short term. Your interest might be making sure that people have a place to go where they're released, or they can get through and have the first few months of rent. And then maybe the onus gets passed over to the housing system itself and being able to get people into more permanent housing options. But it's important to sort of align the funding resources and create programs that address housing needs at each of these different stages and really being able to align timetables and resources to make these initiatives work. And then finally, just a couple of other points that we can't drive home enough: formalizing collaboration, and then really elevating the voices of people with lived experience, not just as sort of a token consultation, but getting them at the planning table from the very beginning as you design a strategy in your community. Next slide. So in terms of key housing partners, I want to start with continuums of care. So a continuum of care is a state, regional, or local planning body. And this system was actually created by HUD. And their mandate is to allocate HUD homeless assistance project funding that HUD provides each year to communities, coordinating needs assessment and prioritization of people for these housing resources. That's the coordinated entry system that I was talking about earlier, as well as overseeing provision of certain rental assistance programs. So how do you engage with the continuum of care? The way to start, particularly if you sit within the justice system, is to join your local COC board, because that is where the decisions get made for who is prioritized for housing resources. Also, as you build these relationships, it's another important strategy is to invite leaders from the continuum of care to key planning groups for the justice system, so that they're able to really more effectively communicate what housing resources are available, what the pain points are, and develop strategies for connecting to housing on the criminal justice end as well. And then also establishing intake points into the coordinated entry system and updating coordinated entry system. So in addition to, so the way the coordinated entry system works is each community has a lot of latitude to establish what are called written standards, deciding who gets prioritized for housing assistance. And there's a lot of latitude by sitting again on the COC board to have some say into what these standards are. Now, again, due to certain HUD rules, people with justice involvement can't always be prioritized for COC programs, but there is a significant opportunity here, particularly for people who qualify under HUD's definition for being at risk of homelessness. Next slide. Another key housing partner is the local public housing authority, which may be what first comes to mind for a lot of you when you think of affordable housing. They control many resources in the community, including public housing and housing choice, otherwise known as Section 8 vouchers. It's very important to work with leadership of housing authorities as well, in addition to COCs, to explore opportunities to prioritize people with justice involvement in existing programs, in public housing, in voucher programs, and especially with new resources being made available under the American Rescue Plan. Sometimes there's actually more opportunity in working with PHA programs to prioritize the folks that we work with, because some of the HUD rules that limit access for COCs don't apply on the PHA side. And again, as I mentioned earlier, HUD is really focusing this year on reducing barriers within its programs to participation of people with criminal records. So it's a great time to engage with your local PHA, understand their application process, and advocate for reducing restrictions based on criminal records. And finally, PHAs control housing choice vouchers, as I said, but a particular type of housing choice vouchers are called project-based vouchers. And these are vouchers that don't come with the person, but they're actually attached to a particular housing unit. This is an excellent source of subsidy to keep a new development feasible. And it's a great way to be able to spur more development for people leaving the justice system. And it's also can be a typical win-win, because it's tough to utilize vouchers in the community. Some landlords are reluctant to accept them. Market rents are going up, so what HUD can pay doesn't keep up. So using project-based subsidies in new developments that serve people with justice involvement can help increase housing options and can help housing authorities solve one of the most common problems that they have. Next slide. So housing finance agencies, typically every state has one. These are agencies that allocate and deploy a lot of resources to actually build new housing across the state, particularly what are known as low-income housing tax credits, which is that program is the biggest source of new affordable housing program funding in the country and has been for quite some time. Developers will often apply to housing finance agencies for these and other resources. And then property management companies are the ones who actually manage the housing. So it's another important strategy to help increase housing access is to advocate to prioritize people with justice involvement in programs such as the tax credit program. And then also, as developers create other units, you're not often going to see a whole housing unit just dedicated to people with justice involvement, but there is a lot of latitude to work with developers in your community to perhaps set aside certain units for people leaving the justice system, or to create strong referral mechanisms to access these units. And then again, I have a couple other points here. The same points as I was talking about with PHAs also apply here to really work with and understand the application process to reduce barriers to access for people with criminal records. Next slide. So then our final housing partner are landlords, and they control most housing inventory in any given community. And in particular, even if you have a housing choice or Section 8 voucher, you need a unit to actually be able to use that in. So being able to partner with landlords is absolutely essential, for both that subsidized housing program as well as just access to housing in general. It's important. One great way to engage landlords and make them more willing to rent to people who've been involved with the justice system is to provide incentives. You can provide small incentives to lease to folks, and additional incentives to keep them housed for 6 months and 12 months. Some communities are also starting to employ an approach called risk mitigation funds, which basically is a pool of resources that landlords can draw on, in the case of extensive damages to the property, in case someone leaves without paying rent, etc. Next slide. So to finish my portion here, to review, key questions to think about as you build collaboration. Who are the key housing providers in your area? How can I get to know them? Who in our community is going to be the champion of this work? Who is going to sit at different tables for the housing system, the criminal justice system, and advocate to prioritize people leaving the justice system? What are the barriers that are most relevant in our state community for people with justice involvement accessing housing? Is it the supply of units? Is it landlords not being willing to rent? Is it the housing search process itself? And then finally, how are you going to put it all together? And how are you going to engage champions, housing partners, and other providers to meet your shared mission? Next slide. So now it's my pleasure to pass it over to Zach Scheffner from the State of Colorado Department of Local Affairs, Division of Housing, to talk about the work that they've done across systems, across departments, to develop supportive housing opportunities for individuals and families with justice system involvement. Zach?
Thanks so much, Charlie. And want to just say, there are a few better introductions to my slide deck than the one that Charlie just provided. I mean, so many of the topics that he brought up are going to come up in what I'm going through, and it's going to save us hopefully some time since you've already got a little bit of a great primer here. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll just go through a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. It's a little bit about where the state of Colorado is coming from, how we've gotten to where we are, then to those points of how are we expanding the supply, how are we increasing access to that supply by individuals with justice system involvement, and then really looking at what's next. What are we seeing those next big issues we're ready to take on? Colorado has made some tremendous strides on this work, but we also know there's still a lot more to be done. So if we can jump to the next slide. So really quickly, I think a critical aspect of how we at the state of Colorado see the issue of homelessness, and I'll share a link to this really fantastic document called the Making Homelessness History Playbook. And this idea being that when homelessness occurs, and we know that homelessness can occur for a variety of different reasons, from family breakup, incarceration, high cost of housing, we want to have a system in place to quickly respond to ensure that anyone who experiences homelessness, that homelessness is rare and brief. And really this vision that we have, that we can create a future where homelessness is rare and brief and no one gets left behind. And I really like that second half of that frame because it really brings in this idea of acknowledging some of the historic inequities that have come when we've advanced housing solutions in the past, and also understanding really this truly has to be, we want to get to functional zero and some of those terminologies that I'll talk about a little bit later. And in order to do that, if we really want to get to zero, we have to build those intentional partnerships for folks with the greatest barriers to housing stability. And oftentimes that means justice system involvement. Next slide, please. So this, and I won't go through all of these, but this just sort of, again, is in the playbook document I shared and really just shows you this was really an organizing document for us within the state of Colorado to put together the playbook. We had input from our Department of Human Services, our Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing, the state Medicaid agency, to really get everybody on the same page of we're going to try and stop homelessness before it starts. So prevent that inflow, do that diversion work. We're going to quickly identify folks and make sure they're safe through street outreach, non-congregate emergency shelter, other tools like that. We're going to connect people with the supports they need. That's supportive services, case management, affordable housing. And we're going to look at those long-term structural solutions that we know impact every other step of this. And we know we need to start with equity. We need to acknowledge those inequities and racial disparities that have that have been a part of this. If we don't do that, we know we are doomed to perpetuate those inequities as we work to advance new solutions and bring in things. I'm going to talk a little bit more in just a second on that real-time person-specific data, but all of this is focused on housing and this common understanding that housing is a basic building block, going to some of those housing first, best practices that Charlie mentioned earlier, and understanding that that housing provides that foundation for individuals to engage with case management, to work on employment, to reconnect with family, and all those other items. And then again, just as Charlie said, cross-sector partnerships are a major component of what we want to do. Next slide, please. Also a part of this was just, what are we going to focus on? And we sort of put together this list of proven solutions of this is where we really see the universe and where different entities can see themselves. Some folks, if you're doing a transitional housing program, really maybe it's that anti-poverty supports of providing, employment, education, some of those services like that. But if you're doing street outreach, we want it to be housing focused street outreach. We want to be connected to the system. If you're going to do emergency shelter, we want to see it be low barrier. If you're going to do rapid rehousing, or supportive housing, we want to make sure you have those adequate supports in place. So these proven solutions, we need it all, and we need it all for individuals with justice system involvement. And that's really been a major aspect of what we're trying to do in Colorado. And these at the bottom, these are all the bottom left. Those are all real participants from our supportive housing programs referred through our Department of Corrections partnership. And most of them are still in housing, which is really cool. All right, next slide, please. So this data component is super essential. And this comes through some of the work we've done with community solutions and Built for Zero is really in order to get an understanding of the effectiveness of our approach, we have to get to quality data. And these 7 key data points around inflow, active, and outflow really underscore everything we do and understanding how is this intervention impacting these numbers. If we make an investment in a housing navigation program to help individuals justice system involvement, but we don't see the outflow happening, that's going to raise some red flags for us. And so across our continuums of care and across our state, we're really trying to get to this dynamic data. Folks have probably come into contact with the point in time or McKinney-Vento data. This is really what we see as the gold standard for tracking and evaluating the success of our systems. Next slide, please. So these are some of the goals that we've set around, again, always going back to the playbook. And this is some of the goals that our cabinet level working group has really started to set around looking at where we have state systems going to inflow, right? So we know, and they are fully aware at our Department of Corrections, the relationship that they have on that inflow data piece, our foster care systems, our behavioral health institutions, or folks who are staying in those mental health hospitals. We need to also look at how we're identifying individuals. In Colorado, we have one shared homeless management information system, or HMIS system, which has been incredibly valuable because we can actually track individuals across the state and consistently evaluate the success of our programs, which has been very, very helpful. And we also need to create the interventions that meet the needs. And that means non-congregate emergency shelter, also bridge housing. We're really starting to see the need for that, especially with justice involved folks. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But then also really we having this laser focus on supportive housing because we know supportive housing is an incredibly effective tool. It's a nationally established best practice. I'll talk about, we've seen it replicated of the success of supportive housing in our backyards here in Denver. And so really want to continue to focus on that as a very valuable tool. Again, we need this full continuum. Permanent supportive housing, I often frame it as that's the intervention for the individuals who are the least likely to self-resolve their homelessness. Some individuals may only need a rapid rehousing. Some folks, the majority of folks who experience homelessness may only need short-term rental assistance or relief, and maybe a short-term stay in emergency shelter. And we are really focusing our resources on those folks who are the least likely to resolve their homelessness, understanding that those interventions are the most expensive or costly. I think there's an important distinction between costly and expensive, but we really see supportive housing as we have a great return on investment for those individuals with those really complex needs, histories of evictions and justice system involvement, high systems utilization. Next slide. So again, as I just said, why do we have those focus? Because we know supportive housing works, because we know housing is that basic building block that people need to engage with supportive services to reduce their emergency system utilization. And we need to have insights into how the state impacts those 7 key data factors, right? We at the state of Colorado know that our systems are contributing to that inflow, and we have a role in the amount of time folks spend experiencing homelessness and how quickly they exit that homelessness through all the sort of different levers that we have control over, and then the ones that we don't, how we can incentivize them. All right, next slide. This is just a quick slide to give you a sense of sort of the cost of supportive housing and where we see it. And this is really deep dive and very Colorado specific, but on that creating housing, we at the Division of Housing, we are a public housing authority, but we also do gap financing. So we create, housing construction. We provide grants and loans for that purpose. We pay for rent in the form of rental subsidies and vouchers. And really, I would say, as we've learned, there's no such thing in my mind as supportive housing without vouchers. It's incredibly difficult to do it. It can be done, but we haven't cracked it just yet. So we really need that voucher to pay for that as that operating subsidy for the building and or to pay the rent to the landlord. Really, where we are again super focused is this services piece, and knowing that there are individuals and state agencies who have a key role in providing those services. So that's our human services, our recently formed Behavioral Health Administration, our Medicaid agency, our Department of Corrections, Department of Public Safety. They all have a role in providing those services, and the services are key. As Charlie said, it's housing first, not housing only. Those services have to be provided aggressively. The saying we like to use is that services are mandatory for staff and optional for clients. And I think that's really helpful to understand that really that we know that those individuals may not engage, but it's going to be that every day, hey, whenever you're ready to engage, we're here. We're going to make it really attractive. We're going to provide all sorts of incentives for you to engage. But if you don't want to engage yet, that's okay. You have a lot of trauma. You have a lot of systems that you've had negative experiences with. We're going to be patient. We're going to engage with you. And your housing is not going to be conditional upon your engaging with those services. And so we've set a pretty audacious goal. We want to see another 1,500 PSH units in the next 3 years. And this is just sort of a rough cost of what that's going to cost us. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide is, I think, really great because it ties together a really exciting partnership that we started in 2014 between our Department of Housing, where I work, and our Public Housing Authority, CHAFA, who is the low-income housing tax credit allocation entity. And that partnership, and I know different states have different strategies around this, was to say, okay, let's make sure that if you are doing supportive housing, you need both the vouchers, and if you're doing it at a large scale, you're going to need low-income housing tax credits because these buildings typically can't support a large amount of debt. So we're going to put those together and have this joint underwriting, and that's started in 2014. And has been incredibly successful since then. If you'll jump to the next slide, please. And so we allocate the way those vouchers work, right? And again, Charlie covered a lot of this, which is super helpful, but individuals pay 30% of their income towards rent. The voucher pays the rest. Together, that forms the operating costs. The project-based vouchers, super critical because you can, just as Charlie said, you can control, you can provide that long-term operating subsidy to the building. If you're providing project-based vouchers, you can also be prescriptive about who is going to be leasing up. And you can ask questions because it's very competitive now for who gets our project-based vouchers because they're tied to the LIHTC and the qualified QAP plan that CHAFA has. So you get extra points if you do supportive housing, but we ask a ton of questions about what your plan is around case management, supportive services, how you're going to pay for those supportive services. You're not just going to magically philanthropy is going to could provide those dollars. We're being very prescriptive because it is so competitive about what are you leveraging? How are you accessing Medicaid? How are your mental health providers going to be there? We've set standards around 15-to-1 case management ratios and 7,200 in annual supportive service costs based on some of the partnership that we have with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, who's been incredibly valuable in the work we have done here in Colorado. Next slide, please. And you can jump one more ahead. So really, this joint underwriting has been incredibly powerful. Just on Tuesday of this week, we had our 9% low-income housing tax credit allocations come out, and we had a record 5 supportive housing projects funded, which is more than we've ever had, 190 units. They're going to be coming online in the next few years. And so that's really the value of joint underwriting, is we've been able to steadily increase the number of our projects, get our low-income housing tax credit allocation agency on board, and them to really see the value that these are long-term valuable projects. Next slide, please. Another aspect of joint underwriting in increasing supply has been something called the Pathways Home Supportive Housing Toolkit. It's a partnership that we have with our Colorado Housing and Finance Authority and Division of Housing and the folks from Bo Simone Consulting. And the idea is building supportive housing is incredibly difficult. You have to weave together complex funding streams. You're talking about vouchers, you're talking about low-income housing tax credits. Property management in supportive housing looks very different than your typical affordable housing. In Colorado, we have like a developer fee boost that can go to supportive services. We have all sorts of really complex funding tools. And if you're just a reentry provider, or you're a homeless service provider who's used to running an emergency shelter or a street outreach operation, it's really challenging to step into the arena of affordable housing development. And so this is really a process where we help train staff, and then they put together a project concept. So it's not just a training. We're saying, okay, you're going to do this, participate in this intensive project. We want to see a result. We want to see a 50-unit supportive housing project. And this really puts our supportive housing, or puts our supportive service providers on level footing so that they can be demanding and say, okay, we're going to take on this work of building this building. We want some of that developer fee. And so that really incentivizes them. And by having your service provider in the driver's seat, you can make sure that if you're a reentry provider, you're thinking about that throughout the duration of saying, okay, if we're going to build a new construction LIHTC project, 50 units supported with project-based vouchers, how are we going to ensure, what's the tenant selection plan going to look like? How are we going to structure things and really ensure that the supportive service managers in the driver's seat, because these projects are not easy to put together. And if you're not careful, you'll just end up with more of what you've done. It really takes some community leaders to say, wait a minute, there's an unmet need in our affordable housing stock for supportive housing, and then amongst our supportive housing, do we have projects that meet the needs of the different populations? So if you could jump one more slide ahead there. So we've really developed, I think this is a little bit number that doesn't include the most recent awards from this week, but thousands of supportive housing units that have come online through this toolkit process, and really doing some matchmaking, helping our service providers understand, okay, what is it going to mean for you to do an RFP to select a development partner? How are we going to train you to you can put out a great RFP to get a developer who's not just doing this because CHFA has made it an attractive proposition from a LIHTC award perspective. So it's been really valuable to have this toolkit to create that pipeline of new projects that we can track, that we can provide technical assistance to. We participate very heavily in that toolkit, so it really gives us the chance to share with them what our priorities are, and then really build that capacity amongst providers. So one of the projects that was funded is a partnership between a homeless service provider and the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe in Cortez, Colorado, which is super exciting. Another one is a youth service provider, The Place, who's developing their first permanent supportive housing project. So we've been able to really bring in new partners through this toolkit process. Next slide, please. I could talk about this program all day. So when we have really, this is probably been one of the most effective tools. And so for folks who are not aware, in 2017, Colorado legalized recreational marijuana. And Colorado, again, for folks who are not familiar, we have a very interesting state budget and something called the TABOR, or the Taxpayers Bill of Rights, which really makes it difficult and really limits the amount of funding that we at the state have. And so this new funding source through marijuana tax cash sort of opened up this new possibilities. And we really said, okay, we know there's a dire need for more resources for homelessness. And so that marijuana tax cash fund we use to fill the gaps that exist in some of the federal resources, and also just expand and continue to work on those proven solutions. So we created a state subsidy, and I know I'm eager to talk. There's some folks from Georgia who have done something similar on a state-funded rental subsidy, but we were able to say, if we could create a state-funded rental subsidy from the ground up, what would it look like? How would it differ from a housing choice voucher? So you're able to do things like drop those criminal screening criteria down to 0, provide double deposits to incentivize landlords, provide security, damage payments mid-lease in the event that we have a client who has a rough day and causes some damage to that unit. It's much more affordable and a better use of our funding to fix that unit, to like fix that hole in the wall, put a new window in, than have to have that client get evicted and have to find a new unit or something like that, or sign a mutual rescission of lease and us have to find a new unit. So it's been really valuable for us to have this state-funded flexible subsidy where we could make those changes, really look at our termination practices and saying, we're really going to do everything we can, because we know we got those 7 key data points. We're looking at inflow. If we have someone in our rental program who's returning to homelessness from housing, we want to know about that. And so that's why we're really designing the program with that in mind, to prevent and keep folks, because the housing choice voucher subsidy is great, but it really wasn't designed in my mind to do supportive housing. It's really a low income housing subsidy, and we've really said, okay, let's supercharge it with all these really neat improvements and strategies. And it did take some local funding to do that, but I think it's been really exciting, to Charlie's point about what HUD is saying around reducing those barriers for all rental assistance programs. Next slide, please. Another tool on increasing the access, just as the Homeless Solutions Program has increased access for individuals with justice system involvement. So we serve anybody and everybody. We do not have provisions on individuals who are sex offenders or individuals who have produced meth in a public housing, which are some of the 2 big barriers for HCV vouchers. So the Vera Institute and some of the work we've done with them has really been focused on looking at our internal policies and practices and saying, what do our tenant selection plans look like? And that's where we've really started to, I spent a lot of time looking at tenant selection plans. And typically they are owned by individual buildings, but we really want to ask, what are the criminal screening criteria? And then if you are going to have criminal screening criteria, what kind of appeals process can we have? If you really feel that you can't serve this particular population, let's add as much nuance as we can so that we can sort of differentiate between, different types of SO status look very different. So we want to have that, but try and screen as many people in as we can to do that. Build for Zero and the work we've done with Community Solutions, really looking at sharing that data, doing that collaboration, really being focused on housing placements, coming up with that coordination of doing case conferencing, of matching individuals and looking at our landlord engagement and things like that. And all of this, again, is our intervention successful? And then have we seen that success replicated in the data? Because if we're doing we can do all sorts of wild wheelies and spins and tricks and donuts, but until we see it reflected in the data, we don't know if it's actually successful. Next slide, please. So I talked about in our backyard, right? There's no shortage of studies showing that supportive housing and a housing first approach are effective. But every couple of years, you got to do a new one. And the Denver Social Impact Bond, which was a really exciting, and we at Division of Housing were really excited to support it. But the results came in And when your evaluator calls your program a remarkable success, it's a pretty good sign. The Denver Social Impact Bond was initially created, and frankly, it was a decision to say, well, we can either build another jail for however many millions of dollars, or we can look at a supportive housing program focused on those individuals. The social impact bond, the pay for success model focused on reductions in jail stays, really seeing incredible housing retention rates and housing stability rates through the Denver Social Impact Bond. And we're going to continue to build on that. But these, and I talk about this with some of our DOC clients, we've hit bedrock. These are the hardest clients to serve. These are the clients who can live independently, but they've got really complex needs. They have a lot of trauma, really have, are not, if I were in their case, right, but they do not have trust of a lot of these systems and institutions. So it takes a lot of time and energy to build those relationships, to engage and do the street outreach or in-reach into correctional settings to do that. Next slide, please. All right, so what's next? And I'll talk a little bit here, and I know we want to leave room for questions. I'll just say some really neat things going on right now are sort of looking at our folks coming out of Department of Corrections who are under parole supervision, but also the folks who are not under parole supervision, because we know both of those populations we're seeing in the inflow data, right? So some individuals come out of Department of Corrections or know they're never going to make it through a parole process. And so they wait, and the framing is they kill their number and then they come out and they don't have housing. So we're really looking at that as a key aspect. And another piece here is bridge housing. So bridge housing is a pretty new housing intervention. Different folks call it different things. What we talk about when we talk about bridge housing in Colorado is a safe place for individuals to reside while they are waiting to utilize a supportive housing resource. So it's not transitional housing. Everybody who goes into bridge housing has a resource, but if you're searching for a unit or waiting for landlords, this bridge housing is really critical. It's incredibly difficult to move someone from Department of Corrections to an apartment. They need client choice into where they're going to be living. And so bridge housing allows them to do that, and non-congregate shelter provides a lot of opportunities for that. The ARPA funding has been incredibly valuable. Our legislative session wrapped up last week, and we have $600 million coming to Colorado through ARPA for affordable housing and homelessness. And really, we want to spread it across that continuum of proven solutions, and know that those best practices and everything that came before this, we're not trying anything new. We're doing what we know works. We're not super creative here in Colorado. We just borrow from the best. We listen, we show up, and we try to replicate what's been successful. And so especially with these one-time resources, we've really built the systems and the data infrastructure that we can really push through and say, okay, we're going to make these investments in supportive housing. We're going to continue to increase our LIHTC. We're going to continue to build that pipeline of new projects coming in, and ultimately continue to have that focus on justice system involved individuals, and building that continuum for them as well, since oftentimes in the past they've been excluded from a lot of these resources. All right, I think that's it from me. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Zach. We continue to be impressed by all the great work that Colorado has done in this area. And I really appreciate you sharing with us today. So Zach's contact information is on the screen there. If you want to jot that down, we will also be sending these slides out after the webinar as well. We only have a few minutes for live questions and answers. So if you have a burning question you want to ask, now's definitely the time to put it into the Q&A. But Zach, you're not quite off the hook yet. I'm going to ask you a question myself, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
After hearing about all this work that Colorado has done, particularly focusing on folks who are at the state level, but doesn't have to just be limited to that, it can be overwhelming to understand how to get started. If you're maybe a little bit newer at doing cross-system work to kind of increase housing access for people with justice involvement, do you have any advice on first steps that people can take to get the work started?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's putting together a program focused on individuals' justice system involvement, trying to carve out some rental subsidy resources and saying, okay, how are we going to fill these opportunities, whether it's tenant-based or project-based? I think tenant-based is a good place to start. And really then asking, okay, how are we identifying these individuals? What's the referral source? Are we working through our coordinated entry system? And saying, again, this is a lot of the federal resources really favor individuals who are chronically homeless, which many folks coming out of institutional settings do not meet the chronic homelessness definition. So I think starting with a project, and then you're going to really build your expertise. We learned a lot. We learned that there's no such thing as tenant-based rapid rehousing, or sorry, project-based rapid rehousing. You need to have individuals transition. So we had a program called our CORE program, or Colorado Rapid Rehousing Reentry. That was a reentry program. Some of the referrals came directly from Department of Corrections. Some came from the continuums of care. It all really started with our second chance, our C-Sharp program, Colorado Second Chance Housing and Reentry Program. I think I've got that right, funded through a grant to the federal, the U.S. Department of Justice, and I may get that wrong, but that really was our starting point. We learned a lot then. What does it mean? What kind of case management? But just getting a program going, and then I haven't even talked about data interoperability, but that can come later. That's big work. I think just starting with a program is always my recommendation, even if it's a small 10 people, 5 people. Just how do we fill this program? How is it successful? How do we target referrals in a really deliberate way?
Thanks so much, Zach. And it looks like we just had one more question pop up in the chat just now for you. Let's see. So it looks like somebody from Denver, who's ED of My Father's House Incorporated, with a wait list for over 100 men in the DOC waiting for beds, coming directly out of prison into transitional housing. You know, they're asking how they can partner with you and the state to grow, but I think we can also pose that as a more general question. You know, if we have housing providers out there who are looking to partner with the state and build partnerships, what's a step that they could take?
Sure, I think it's around, are those community resources compatible with our state and supportive housing resources more specifically? And we learned this is really tricky. A lot of reentry providers may have spaces that include congregate living settings. So that means that a voucher may not be compatible with those units. And so that can oftentimes be a real barrier to using our vouchers in some of those reentry settings, is that if an individual doesn't have a lease agreement, or services are tied to the lease agreement. I think that's a really critical aspect, and your local public housing authority can speak to that, of like, if somebody had a Section 8 voucher, could they use it here? Are there changes we would need to make for it to be compatible here? And then just, I think we need it all. So those creative partnerships are so critical to saying, okay, this is the resource we have. This is how we can partner with coordinated entry. Like, working with coordinated entry just to ensure your clients have access to the resources through coordinated entry are critical, but also just asking those questions of, can we start coming to meetings? Can we go to case conferencing? Because like Charlie said at the beginning, we're talking about the same population. And I really think if you focus on high utilizers, like, we're paying for this. That's where a lot of this work becomes very attractive to legislators and other stakeholders, is we're paying for this. We can either pay to keep folks in these very high cost settings with inpatient care, which they may not need, or we can pay for them to be in a supportive housing intervention. I hope that helped answer the question.
I think that was great. Thank you, Zach. So hopefully we've gotten to everything. You know, also for folks who are answering it, you know, we will be sending out the slides and the recording to everybody who's registered. We are also going to post the slides and the recording to the CSG Justice Center's website too. So people who weren't able to join us today will definitely get the chance to get this great content. All right, so we have just a few minutes left. I want to go through our next steps and resources. Next slide. So I know we only had a few minutes for Q&A today. We threw a lot of information at you, but good news, we have another opportunity to engage with us and get your questions answered. For each webinar session, 2 weeks after the webinar session, in the same time slot on Thursdays from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern, we're going to have office hours. And basically, this is going to be an informal opportunity to talk to our community presenter, in this case, Zach, myself, or another subject matter expert from CSH, and really ask some targeted questions focused on how you can take the next steps in the community to be doing this work. And we'll also be providing a discussion guide and resource as part of those office hours that you can help work through. The focus of the first session is going to be on partnership building. So we'll have some resources to help you think through identifying who are your housing partners and how can you meaningfully engage with them to prioritize housing for people leaving the justice system. So we've got the registration link here for the office hours. I will also email that out to everybody who registered along with the recording and the slides. We'd really encourage you to join us. It'll be a great opportunity in a much more informal setting to learn more and get your questions answered. Next slide. So our next session is going to be June 23rd, same time, 2 o'clock Eastern, and it's going to be focused on prioritizing housing resources for people with justice involvement. Hope that a lot of you can join us. Hopefully some new folks can join us as well too. There'll be a particular focus on all the new resources that have been made available through ARP, the American Rescue Plan Act. HUD has been very public about their desire to really want to prioritize people with justice involvement for these resources. So we're going to talk more about how to do that and have some communities sharing with us how they have done this work. So we got the registration link here, and that is another thing that we will also be emailing out to you afterwards. Next slide. So a few resources. I want to provide here a link to our action points brief if you want to see a written version of what we were talking about today. It's a great foundational document. I refer back to it often myself. Next slide. We also have an article that we recently published as part of Second Chance Month, focused on continuums of care and strategies for how folks who sit within the criminal justice system can build partnerships and engage with their local COCs, again, to increase housing opportunities for people leaving prisons and jails. Next slide. I want to highlight a couple of funding opportunities that are coming out from BJA and are closing relatively soon. The FY22 Second Chance Act Pay for Success Initiative. This is a great opportunity to fund housing and other reentry initiatives. And with regard to housing, particularly permanent supportive housing and recovery housing, it provides really a unique source of technical assistance as well as funding support to develop performance-based contracts to really help fund these services and reduce the risk to public funders in funding these programs, because basically the contracts, part of the payments are tied to meeting certain outcomes, such as reduction in returns to prison and jail, keeping people stably housed, etc. So it's a great opportunity. We highly encourage you to check it out and apply. Next slide. Second BJA funding opportunity is JMHCP, the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program. This is another great opportunity to support your work in the community, support cross-system collaboration to improve responses to people with mental health or substance use disorders who have been involved with the justice system. As a reminder, that is how Sonoma funded the great work that they're doing there. And so another thing to definitely look at and encourage you to apply. Next slide. Again, I've talked about this a couple times today because it's so important. We have a link here to the directive that came out last month from HUD to reduce barriers across HUD programs to participation for people with justice involvement. HUD traditionally has given a lot of discretion to housing providers in terms of their screening criteria in particular. And HUD has really come out in a very public way to make the statement that discretion should not equal denial. And it's great to see HUD taking that position publicly And over the next 6 months, they're really going to be reviewing all their programs and looking at regulations, notices, and guidances to see how they can reduce barriers. Next slide. We also just wanted to highlight a couple of resources from CSH. Speaking of that recent HUD memo, CSH did a great write-up highlighting the key points of this memo, the evidence of the impact of housing and supportive services, and basically just a call to action to share recommendations for HUD and for housing providers for how to really work to reduce barriers to people with criminal records. Next slide. Another CSH resource, recent resource, is a report that we're featuring here that provides recommendations for investments in supportive housing to break that homelessness and jail, the incarceration cycle that I was showing you earlier. These are focused around New York City, but they really are applicable in a lot of different places. So I encourage you to check this out for some ideas in your own community. Next slide. Thank you so much for participating today. Again, please feel free to contact me via email with any additional questions. We definitely love to help you out. We hope that you'll join us for our office hours in 2 weeks. We'd love to have a lot of you there for a rich discussion, and join us for the rest of our webinar series. So keep an eye out on your email for more information, and thank you so much for joining us today. Bye, everybody.